Hi everyone, it's Mary Brownlee, licensed professional counselor. I'm so glad to have you back with me today. Today we're going to talk about some common behaviors that happen in abusive relationships. So I know we talked a little bit about ACE scores and adverse childhood experiences, but a lot of times those don't quite capture the whole kit and caboodle, shall we say, of abusive relationships. So I thought I'd go into a couple of different specific things that we see on a regular basis in abusive relationships. So what you're looking for, because everybody can display some of these kind of toxic or unhealthy behaviors once in a while. None of us are perfect, for example, but what we're really looking for is a repeated pattern of these types of behaviors showing up throughout the lifespan of the relationship. That will give you an idea that this is something much larger in a grander scale than just the average person maybe not being on their best behavior, for example, or having a bad day, or maybe they're sick, or something going on where they're not themselves and they might do something hurtful. So what you're really looking for is repeated consistent behaviors over time, of which we'll be talking about. A lack of accountability. So oftentimes abusive people are not accountable for hurtful behaviors. You can try to address it with them, for example, but they're never really going to be held accountable. They will typically do a variety of behaviors, which we'll talk about, things like gaslighting or blame shifting, basically passing the buck. Sometimes they play the victim, and it's everybody else's fault but theirs. So there's a variety of behaviors here, and we'll go into those. So the first one is gaslighting. So what is gaslighting? So gaslighting is basically undermining somebody's reality. So usually, in a healthy family, for example, children are raised with their own thoughts, feelings, and needs, for example, being important to the parents. So the children grow up with a sense of self-esteem, healthy identity. They're able to kind of understand boundaries, like this is okay, this is not okay, I'm comfortable with this, I'm not comfortable with that, for example. And they'll have their own mind that's pretty well developed by the time they're a young adult or engaging in adult relationships. So typically what happens is when we come from a family with high ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences, we are more prone, unfortunately, to engaging in relationships with a lot of these toxic behaviors, not because we're doing it on purpose, but because our traumatic childhoods can kind of leave us blind to a lot of these behaviors. And we oftentimes don't trust ourselves, for example, because our trust in ourselves has been undermined by an abusive parent or family. So yeah, we're more prone to being gaslit by an abuser. So gaslighting basically looks like somebody telling another person that their thoughts, feelings, perceptions, ideas, etc. are wrong, even when it's very clear that they're right. So for example, this is just a completely left field example, but to give you an idea of how it works, say you went outside and it's raining and you're like, my goodness, it's raining outside. How cool is that? And instead the abuser is going to be like, it's not raining. What are you talking about? You're crazy. It's bright as like the sun is out. What is wrong with you? So gaslighting basically looks like that, where your own thoughts, feelings, and perceptions, and even what you know to be true, is basically told by the other person that it's not true and that you're crazy. So yeah, and you gaslight somebody's reality for a long period of time, you bet that they're going to have a hard time trusting themselves and knowing what's real and not real, and thinking that they're crazy. So yeah, gaslighting is a pretty destructive way to psychologically abuse somebody. That's psychological abuse, basically. The next one is blame shifting. So blame shifting is really, instead of taking accountability, in a healthy relationship, ideally what it should look like is if somebody hurts somebody else's feelings inadvertently, sometimes that happens to the best of us, you hear somebody going, oh, I'm so sorry I said something to hurt you, or I'm so sorry that my behavior caused harm. I didn't intend to. I apologize. It won't happen again. Please forgive me. And it's pretty easy, for example, to have a conversation with somebody who's healthy about any damage that may have happened in the relationship. In abusive relationships, this doesn't happen. So you're never really able to get closure or accountability from the abuser, because the abusers typically have a vested interest in being right all the time. They oftentimes, relationships are based on control dynamics. They're not actually based on connection. That's something I work with a lot of my clients on, is understanding that the abuser's motivation for engaging in a relationship with you is going to be completely different than yours. They actually don't want loving, close connections with other people. They want control. So all of these dynamics are about control and maintaining control over other people. If it were really about connecting, you would feel that, and it would be intuitive, and it would be relatively easy. You would be able to connect to them on a heart level. So in abusive relationships, you can't connect to people on a heart level. It's impossible. It takes two people to want to connect on a heart level for relationships to work on that level. Yeah, one person cannot carry the torch for both people. So blame shifting essentially is when you try to hold an abusive partner or friend or family member accountable for their behavior, and typically what you'll see them is they will shift blame onto something else, whether it's another person, another experience or event, it'll be some excuse. They're essentially searching for some excuse as to why it's not their fault. And typically they'll shift it back onto you. Well, it's actually your fault. You're the ones that's to blame. Sometimes they'll play the victim. So playing the victim is another behavior that we see abusive individuals do, where it'll be like the poor pity me party. And again, reminder, these are behaviors that happen consistently throughout the lifespan of the relationship, just not once in a while. It's consistent, repeated exchanges where these type of behaviors take place. Blame shifting is essentially lack of accountability and passing the buck to someone else. And victim blaming also happens in abusive relationships. I've seen that one. Victim blaming is blaming the victim for being abused. So you'll see that commonly, unfortunately, a lot of times in our culture, for example, with rape victims, for example, oh, what were you wearing that night? You shouldn't have been wearing that skirt. I just cringe even hearing, myself say that, because it's just so awful. But unfortunately, that has happened to women frequently in this country, where they're blamed for their own abuse, for example, or domestic violence victims. Maybe the woman is like in the hospital on death's doorstep. Well, it's her fault. She didn't leave the relationship. She should have left the relationship sooner. Ooh. Yeah. So victim blaming is another thing that you see happen in unhealthy families or unhealthy dynamics here, where people don't ever want to hold the abuser accountable. So they blame the victim for the abuse. And that's really bad. It's really bad. And it's like a doubly damaging to the victim as well, who is just trying to survive and now is being blamed for their own demise. So yeah, that's really bad. Withholding is another one we commonly see. So withholding and silent treatment, for example, can be interchanged as well. So withholding is basically withholding like love and affection. You can also withhold a response, as in silent treatment. So withholding love and affection is really, we see this, for example, in relationships where the person withholds their love and affection to try to punish the partner. So they're unhappy with the partner or the family member's behavior, whatever that might be. And in order to control them, because again, all of these behaviors are about control, not connection, they will withhold affection, or they'll withhold talking. They won't talk to their partner, for example. So that's like silent treatment. And it's done with the intention to harm and control. So I like to tell clients, silent treatment is not the same as, say, no contact, or withdrawing from a conflict because it's become too heated and you need some time to, let things cool off. Those are not the same as silent treatment. Silent treatment is done on purpose with the intention to control the altercation. No contact is done with the intent to protect yourself and to stop engaging in endless loops of abusive conversations. It's very different. Withholding is commonly done, again, by people who are unhappy. They want to control the exchange in some way, shape, or form, and they don't know how to communicate their needs in a healthy way. So they just kind of stonewall and shut down and engage in these type of kind of controlling, emotionally abusive, ways. Invading privacy is another one. So this is something we see quite a bit in controlling abusive relationships as well, is the person or the abuse victim will have no right to privacy. So boundaries, for example, boundaries are repeatedly disrespected. Say the victim is like, can you please not speak to me that way? I find it really harmful. Please stop doing that, or, we're not going to be able to remain friends anymore, or something like that. Um, and so the abusive person will never, ever, ever be able to respect boundaries. In fact, your biggest clue that you're dealing with an abusive person is if you try to set a boundary and say, hey, that's really harmful, please don't do that. And the person literally flips their lid and engages in even more abuse towards you. So that's your first red flag clue here that you're dealing with an abuser, somebody who cannot take the word no gracefully. But yeah, invading privacy, maybe you have a parent, for example, that doesn't value their child's privacy, will barge in their room, will go through their stuff. You might have an abusive partner or spouse that does the same thing. They'll put tracking software on people's phones. They'll be spying on them. So yeah, invading privacy. Basically, the victim doesn't have any privacy. So yeah, that's another sign of an abusive person. Ignoring boundaries, we just talked about a little bit, but yeah, no doubt I'll probably have other videos specific just to setting boundaries and how to handle it when the perpetrator does not respect your boundaries, because this is going to be very, very common. I see a lot of clients when they start setting boundaries for the very first time with an abuser, things can go from 0 to 100 really fast. It can get pretty ugly. So I always tell them, you're doing boundaries for yourself. You're not actually expecting this to work, because if the person is truly abusive, it's not going to work. In fact, it will usually up the ante and make things a lot uglier. Because again, controlling people don't like to lose control. And boundaries are all about us saying, hey, that doesn't work for me. I control my own emotional, psychological space. I control my own safety, and what feels safe to me, you don't get to dictate that. And abusers don't like that. So yeah. Isolation is another one we see commonly with abusers. Abusers know instinctively that if a victim has access to healthy outside friendships and supports, social supports, maybe workplace supports, maybe people at church, etc., but healthy outside supports, that will lessen their ability to control the victim. So oftentimes you'll see especially domestic violence perpetrators will purposely isolate the victim through things like even financial abuse. So they'll disconnect the victim's ability to have easy access to money or funds to control their lives or spending. They'll isolate them from friends and family. Like, I don't want you going over to your friend's house or your family member's house. You need to stay here with me. So isolation is another big red flag of abusers. Devaluation is another one. Devaluation is something that abusers do frequently. They make the victim feel like they're not worthy and not valuable. Things like criticisms and put downs and, constantly undermining that person's self-worth. Yeah, devaluation is something that is verbal abuse, can be emotional abuse, psychological abuse. But yeah, undermining that person's ability to feel good about themselves. And again, anybody who's been in an abusive relationship will commonly say, I was walking on eggshells. Nothing I could do was ever good enough. They were never happy. Yeah, that's because they will never be happy, because fundamentally it is not possible for a victim to make the abuser happy. It's not possible. Again, these relationships are not based on connection and safety and love. They're based on control and abuse. So yeah. Discarding. So this is something we see as well. Typically can happen after the victim starts setting boundaries. We call it the narcissistic discard if you're in a relationship with a narcissist, for example. Again, highly controlling abusive people do not like people having their own mind. They don't like somebody having their own perceptions that are different from theirs. They don't like somebody having their own feelings and thoughts, etc., that are different from theirs. Again, that's threatening. It's threatening to their sense of control. And if they can't control you, they feel an extreme sense of emotional discomfort. That's really their only way, sadly, of feeling safe in this world is through controlling others. So absolutely, if you start saying no and setting healthy boundaries, it is not unusual for the abuser to discard the victim preemptively. Basically, like, you're of no use to me, goodbye. And the way I describe this to clients, especially with narcissistic abusers, is you can pretend that because they treat us like objects, you can pretend that you're a pen, and essentially you can see here, my ink is about halfway gone. So, when this is all the way gone, of course I'm going to throw the pen away because it doesn't have ink in it anymore. It's useless. This is how abusers and narcissists treat us, like a pen. And as soon as we're out of ink, we're no longer useful to them. So what that means is, as soon as you are no longer making them happy, taking care of their needs, dancing to their every whim, just keeping them happy and taking care of all their needs, basically, they have no use for you. So you setting boundaries and saying, no, and that doesn't work for me, typically will create some type of rage and a discard. So it's very common for abusers to discard the victim when the victim is of no use anymore and is inflicted some sort of narcissistic injury is what we would call it. So narcissists and other abusers are very, very vulnerable to shame, intense shame. Typically there is intense self-loathing that they feel. And so it is not uncommon for their own wounded parts, very highly shame-based, to get triggered. And so they will go on the offense and discard just to make themselves feel better. So we'll talk more about that in other videos as well, because that's a topic unto itself that deserves a lot of attention. But I just thought I'd touch upon it briefly here. There are other things like the term fog. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this. Fog comes from the terms fear, obligation, and guilt. So these are three things all manipulative and controlling people do, and abusers, is they use fog to keep people in the fog, basically, literally. Like, as you can imagine, driving on a road where there's a ton of fog, it's very hard to see clearly, and you can get lost more easily. Accidents can happen. And the same thing with these type of abusive behaviors. They keep you in the fog, and it's harder for you to know what direction to take and how to keep yourself safe when these type of abusive behaviors are occurring. So they control their victims through fear. So like intimidation, criticisms, put down, shaming, fear. They're putting the fear into the victim that you do X, Y, Z, or I'm going to do this to you, or there's going to be this outcome. So fear is a very common control tactic that I see in abusive type of relationships. Obligation is another one. Obligation is good old guilt tripping. So basically the abuser's like, well, if you don't do X, Y, Z, you're going to make me suffer, and I'm going to be so sad. And so they either, play the victim to pull on your heartstrings, or some are more just in your face and straight up guilt tripping, So anytime you feel fear or obligation or guilt, for example, that's kind of your red flag that you're being manipulated. Like this, again, this is not connection, this is control. So healthy people don't seek to control other people through fear or making them feel obligated to help out or making them feel guilty about not helping out, for example. Other healthy people can accept your no. And no, I'm so sorry, I'm busy that weekend, it doesn't work for me. Healthy person's going to go, oh, absolutely, no problem. How about another weekend? Sure, no problem. Let's try to do it another weekend. Unhealthy person, and you say you can't. Oh, sorry, Mom, I can't come over and do that this weekend. Oh, after everything I've done for you, oh, this is how you repay me. So that's the type of stuff that they do. They'll react with guilt tripping and making you feel a sense of obligation to help. So I see that very commonly as well. Another thing that we see is slander or smear campaigns. So as I like to say, when the abuser can no longer control you, they will try to control how other people see you. So this is very, very common with all abusers, is when they are losing control of the victim, usually is when this happens, or sometimes they do it preemptively, knowing that they can control other people's relationships with you as well. If other people think that you're now a terrible person, according to them, of course, abusers are not truthful. So they're either going to omit plenty of important details or just flat out lie. And so they will typically do smear campaigning, is where they gossip and tell lies or mistruths or just terrible, nasty information about you behind your back to other people that know you. And slander, just flat out lies. And again, they do this on purpose to control how other people see you and interact with you. And it's isolating. So say you lose a bunch of your friends, for example, that now think that you're this terrible person because your ex-spouse or your family member has said all sorts of lies about you, And I always tell people, healthy people will see this as a red flag and go like, wow, this is really toxic, and I really don't like hearing negative information about other people, especially this person that I know and love, and I really don't want to hear this, or I'm not interested in hearing this. Unhealthy people will engage in gossip and slander and like smear campaigning. They will take kind of pleasure in it. So you'll see really only unhealthy people do this type of behavior. Flying monkeys is another term that a lot of narcissistic abuse forums and sites have referenced. Flying monkeys is where they, again, through the smear campaigning and the gossip and, telling untrue stories about you, they've kind of got this whole gang of people that now think that you are, the evil witch of the West, for example. And so now they don't even have to abuse you directly. They can abuse you by proxy. So it's called abuse by proxy. So they can send their flying monkeys or their minions after you as well, which can frequently and does frequently happen. You'll get, calls or texts or mail, for example, from your family members' friends or coworkers or whoever that are like, oh, how dare you do that to Mrs. Smith? She is just the best person on this planet and you are a terrible person, or you'll hear it from other people basically. And so, again, your best bet to deal with this type of inappropriate behavior is simply to shut it right on down. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not interested in speaking more about this with you. If that person needs to speak with me directly, you can inform them to please speak with me directly, but I'm not interested in talking about whatever's happened between the two of us with you. It's just inappropriate. So yeah, there are some things that you can do to protect yourself. I'll go into more detail in other videos with boundary setting and enforcing boundaries and some common things that we see these unhealthy people do to try to harm us. But overall, I just kind of wanted to help give you a general picture of some of the abusive behaviors that harmful people will typically engage in that is not so textbook. That's more of just plain speak. Violence obviously would be something that abusers of all types engage in as well. But yeah, some of them are less known and people don't recognize that it's abuse until, say, for example, they're sitting in front of me and I'm like, wow, that's emotional abuse, or wow, that's verbal abuse. And that's the first time they've ever even thought of it that way. So a lot of this is important, I think, for us as victims to have a vocabulary and a language to talk about some of these things so that we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the behaviors that impacted us were harmful, were abusive, and should not be tolerated. Because a lot of times we do tolerate things that we should not tolerate, and we've done it for far too long. And a lot of it is because, again, you grow up in a family with high aces, you're not going to have strong boundaries. You're not going to have a strong sense of identity and self-worth. And so we do have some missing gaps, so to speak, where we're more prone to accept unacceptable behavior. We'll talk more about that in other videos as well. So I hope you found this helpful. And again, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you are all well, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.